Hey, so thank you for joining us again this week. We are still in the prologues of Inevitable Ruin. So, this chapter is a Porthus point of view chapter, and it shows the interactions between him and his lawyer while he's negotiating his deal to exit the dungeon. And then next week, we will be on Book 7, Chapter 1.
I didn't know that a book could have so many prologue chapters. Is that normal for a book to have 4 prologue chapters?
If it's a pretty established series, it can be, so that does make sense, but I think it was maybe in The Gate of the Feral Gods where I was just like, "How many epilogues does this book have?" And I was like, "Are these epilogues or, like, is this just plot?"
Uh, I'm gonna go on the side of plot. We wanted to start out by giving an introduction of who is Porthus. So we first learn about Porthus in Dungeon Anarchist Cookbook when Carl receives it, and Porthos was the very first person to ever receive the cookbook during the 15th season of The Crawl on the ninth floor.
So, if he's the first person to get it, but it's the 2nd edition, then what was in the 1st edition? Was it just AI generated?
Yeah, so that's not necessarily clarified, but it does appear that the information in the very first edition was AI generated by Porthos's admission in his cookbook entries that we get throughout the series. It was pretty basic spells and recipes that weren't very useful that he added upon. And then those continued to be added upon by every future recipient of the cookbook.
So, when Porthos was in the crawl, this was really before things like the Apothecary or like the Open Intellect Pacifist Network existed. I would think that one of those groups kind of threw together some basic information and found a way to send it through a gift or something like that. So, it's interesting to think about, but I'm not sure if those groups were even organized enough to plant something like that in the dungeon. Maybe it was a residual.
I mean, I think that it was generated by the dungeon. I think it was something that was born in the dungeon.
Yeah, I'm just not sure what kind of motivations an AI would have for starting something like that, whereas if there was groups that were anti-crawl, it would make a lot of sense for them.
It would. And as far as we are aware in our research, it is not clarified exactly how the cookbook originally came into existence. So, continuing on with who Porthos is, we learn a little bit more about him throughout the series. His first actual entry that we read from the cookbook is in Gate of the Feral Gods. And he talks about how he doesn't feel like he's added enough to the cookbook. Like, if his contributions are ever actually going to be useful, and if there's going to be enough information to be useful in future generations after more people add to it. And I just think it's interesting or important to call out that pretty much everything we hear about Porthos throughout the books is that he seems to have a lot of self doubt of whether what he's done and what he's contributed is actually going to make any kind of difference. And I think that's important to his character and his motivations for why he, does everything he does after his exit from the dungeon.
I mean, we see that start in this chapter where he keeps talking about how Minerva told him to go, but he should have gone back for her anyways. And he has a lot of self doubt and second guessing. And that's what he's obsessing over in most of this chapter. So I would say that that is a core part of his personality.
Definitely.
It is interesting to me that he felt so much guilt about not contributing more when no one had ever contributed before. He was the first person who had it, and he still didn't feel like he was doing enough was interesting to me.
I think that is just a core of the kind of person that he is, that he wants to do more to help people. He feels, I would say, maybe even a bit of a hero complex where he wants to do everything he can to help others, and he feels inadequate no matter what his efforts amount to.
I'm sure that's part of what attracted him to Carl is that Carl also has a hero complex, and like does attract like, so I'm sure that's not coincidence.
Right. And that actually leads into the next point is Porthos is the CEO and president of outreach operations for the Pacifist Network. And he is a driving factor behind why they sponsored Carl on the fifth floor, supported him. They gave him the Tourmaline, which was, what do you call it?
Oh, the biggest MacGuffin that ever existed.
Right.
Um, We should define what a MacGuffin is. So, Merriam Webster says that a MacGuffin is a plot device in a story that serves to motivate characters and drive the plot forward, but is ultimately unimportant to the audience or the story's resolution itself. So, it was definitely that for a while and then became super important.
We already said this, but to clarify, Porthus is the founder of the Open Intellect Pacifist Network. And that is a very big piece of what this chapter amounts to. I also wanted to call out the first actual cookbook entry that we hear from his perspective in the series, which is from Gate of the Feral Gods, where he says, "If I survive my 100 seasons of servitude, I will do everything I can to end this horror. I don't know if I have the strength, but I will do my best to not be broken. This will be my last entry in this book, but I am not yet done with the enemy. As long as I have breath, I will fight." And one thing I wanted to call it here is the "I will do my best to not be broken." I don't know if that reminds you of anything, but sounds a lot like "You will not break me." And I think that's a strong parallel of what drew Porthos to Carl and shows that they do have a lot in common. What did you think?
I think my question is, did his lawyer let him go into the bathroom to write this?
Right, because he obviously wrote this after he made his deal because his deal was 100 seasons as a game guide. So, yeah, did he get the opportunity to make one last entry after he took his deal? Or
I mean, I guess they say that you have a few minutes to sort through your inventory. Maybe he was like, yeah,
yeah.
bathroom first.
Well,
Maybe he has IBS like Carl.
so Carl always goes into the bathroom to read the cookbook, but I think you can make entries into it without having it physically in your hands because, like, when Carl gets it, the AI tells him that he now has like a special scratch pad where he can write stuff into. So maybe you only need to physically hold it if you're reading it.
Now that we've given a bit of background, we're going to start going chronologically through this chapter and discussing it. And I think narratively, this chapter exists to give us some background on Porthos and also to give a perspective of how traumatic it is when you're negotiating these deals and how you have just gotten pulled out of a terrible situation where you maybe
hmm
watched multiple people you know die, and now you have to negotiate, what the rest of your life is going to look like, and how maybe you are not in a appropriate headspace to be doing that at this time.
Yeah. It starts out with him saying his arm keeps shaking. He's trying to get his arm to stop shaking, and that's repeated several times throughout this chapter.
Yeah, because his lawyer is trying to talk to him about what deals are potentially on the table, but he cannot think about anything except for his friend.
We see here right at the very beginning, it basically noted that this lawyer does not seem to give a shit about Porthos. He won't even look at him. And then later in the chapter, that their eyes met for the briefest moment. There was nothing there, no sympathy, nothing.
Don't judge him for bringing snacks, though.
I mean, man's got to eat, right?
I mean, you also don't know how many of these meetings he's doing in a day.
Well, I don't think there's very many people that survived this floor.
That is true. So, Quasar is actually a good lawyer.
What makes Quasar a good lawyer?
The fact that he actually cares, he is very invested in Carl's interests. He is always suggesting new ideas to him. In the next chapter, he's like, "Well, you've been gone, but like I've been doing everything I can while I
Right.
wasn't able to contact you." Whereas I just don't see this lawyer proactively doing anything for any crawlers.
No, he is here to relay information and provide the slightest amount of guidance with absolutely zero sympathy whatsoever. And I just love Quasar coming into every situation like, "Hey, you guys need to stop what you're doing. Stop talking to my client without me being present. This is absolutely ridiculous. I'm going to ram my blah up your blah." Anyways, this isn't an episode about how awesome Quasar is, but come on.
Yeah, so we talked about Minerva earlier, but it is interesting that that is someone that Porthos met in the dungeon and he didn't know beforehand, and he still had such a strong emotional attachment to her, which, we would say that Carl feels that way about Amani or Katya, that they are like family to him, even though he didn't know them before the dungeon. But this season that Carl is in actually does have a very high survival rate.
Records. like tens of thousands higher.
Yeah, so it is interesting to point out that there are still pairings of people who came into the dungeon together and are still together, like Donut and Carl, Amani and Ellie, Li Jun and Zhang. So that is an interesting thing to think about as
Right.
far as Porthos was so traumatized that he didn't know what was going to happen to someone that he didn't even know before he came into the dungeon, and how much worse it would be if it was someone you'd known your entire life.
Right. And he comes into this meeting with his lawyer to make this deal, and he just keeps asking if he can find out what happened to her. And I think that, like they were trying to escape the floor and they were crawling up the back of this giant monster and her foot is trapped or whatever. And he leaves and goes through. And I think the way that he's reacting and behaving in this chapter is similar to how Carl would react. Say it was Carl and Katya was right behind him and he doesn't know if she made it through. Like he's going to be freaking the fuck out.
Well, and what's messed up is he might never know. So
Right.
it's basically like the best analogy that I can have is when I was a teenager, if you missed an episode of a TV show that you were really into, your best chance of finding out what happened was you'd kind of have to call around and see if anyone else had watched it and would tell you about it. So this is kind of the same situation where as Porthos goes into being a game guide, he just has to ask other people, "Hey, did you remember this person? Do you know what happened to her?" And especially with the way that the deals work, you might be on a completely different timeline than everyone you've ever known, where you might be in the dungeon longer than them, and who knows if you'll ever actually meet up. Milk
Right.
is an example of someone who is in the dungeon for an insanely long time.
And like that nobody ever interacted with her and nobody knew what happened to her. Do we find out if Porthos ever knows what happens to Minerva or runs into her?
We don't find out, but I think the way that he would find out is like Mordecai, for example, as a game guide, would probably be pretty up on what happened in the last season. So I think Porthos would go into the dungeon as a game guide and he would need to connect with the other game guides. And it does seem like there is some community there. So, for example, Mistress Tianeth is able to come into the guild hall and is able to spend time with them. So the game guides can interact with each other, and that would be a way that they would share information.
Right, but I mean like after he gets out of the dungeon, does Porthos ever learn or figure out what happened to Minerva?
I don't know.
I guess we don't know.
I mean, I would think once you got out of the dungeon, maybe you could get old episodes of The Crawl and maybe you could find out, but that's
Right.
really up for interpretation.
Is it like Netflix and you can just go and pull old seasons on demand? I mean, I am pretty confident that they have that ability. The next point that they get to is Porthos's lawyer starts giving him his deals. The first deal is crap, even by the lawyer's own admission. He's a floor 15 undead, low chance of survival, but he'll be out fast in like 20 seasons or something, and it comes with a small stipend. No guaranteed housing, and his lawyer specifically says former crawlers always find a place to live, almost always. And it's interesting to note that that was going on so far back, I think thousands of years ago, basically. But Porthos changes this through creating the Open Intellect Pacifist Network. He says, no, crawlers are going to have a place to live. And that's a big piece of what that network does. And that's really powerful as to the impact that he makes. Next part of the chapter that we're talking about, right after he's given his first deal offer, is he asks like, "Can I just leave? Like, I need to know what happens to Minerva." And the lawyer basically tells him, "Sure, you can leave, but the outreach guilds on the 11th floor aren't going to open up until the end of the floor. So if he makes it that far and goes to an outreach guild with like no chance of getting further and actually completing the floor and getting through a door, that his offers aren't going to be nearly as good."
Yeah, definitely. And I think in a lot of scenarios, you're looking at something like maybe there's no chance of survival, but maybe you and one of the people you're with can't survive. And so you would take a not very favorable deal just to avoid that situation.
Right, like, kind of what happened or what was possibly going to happen in Eye of the Bedlam Bride, where there was 3 people and only 2 of them had a key. Maybe there was an outreach guild they could have gone to on a different floor, different scenario, and they were like, "Hey, we all wanna get out. Let's all take shitty deals because we don't want to make this terrible decision.
Yeah, definitely. And we will definitely talk about more at the end of this book in, I don't know, 6 months. But I think that Carl and Donut got offered a really good deal and that they got offered a deal to stay together. And that seems so rare. We haven't heard of any other options of that. That was honestly a sweetheart deal, but I also think it was the AI messing with Carl because it was such a good, obvious deal that he was never going to take.
Does the AI come up with the deals? Actually, I don't know. Who comes up with the deals?
That's a good question. I don't think we know the answer. I've always thought it was the AI. That's just kind of been my back of the head assumption, but you're right that I don't really have any book passages to support that.
I don't either. Not offhand. Maybe one of you do. Let us know.
But the reason that I think the AI is involved in making the deals is they all seem a little ironic. And some of the deals that Porthos got offered seemed like things that he would never possibly accept because they were personally insulting to him.
Right. So, like, he was offered a deal as a hunter attendant, and he was like, there's no way I would freaking do that. The hunters killed all of the NPCs on that floor. Like, why would I want to do that? And his lawyer tells him, oh, it's pretty safe. But he's like, no, they killed everyone. And the lawyer says, only the ones they could find. Come on.
I mean, you also don't know, are the hunters going to get sick of their attendant or, upset with them and go murder bot on them?
Yeah.
Sure, it's safe.
Right. So yeah, if you're as long as your attendant does everything you want and you're perfectly happy with them. I wanted to go back to Bree saying that, she felt like it was a really good deal. And it was a very good deal that Donut and Carl were offered to stay together and take over Chaco's role on the prize wheel. And when Bree read their deal, and before I had even gotten to that point, she was like, they were given a really good deal. I think they should have taken it. And just told her, it doesn't matter what kind of awesome deal they were given. There's no shot in the world that Carl was ever going to take a deal, no matter what it was. That is absolutely antithetical to everything.
Well, and I think that kind of shows that Carl is an anti-hero because I think he wants to believe for himself that his love for Donut is always his first purpose and that he's making all the decisions with her best interest in mind, but that's not true.
Yeah, I don't think he's not always doing that. Like, she is a very high priority to him, but he definitely makes a lot of decisions that are pretty risky and put her life and other people's lives in danger. I think, what do they call it? Carling it up.
Definitely.
Don't Carl it up, Carl.
But yeah, I think that his version of himself that he believes isn't always true.
Right, and I think we see that with Porthos as well.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I can definitely elaborate on that. So we learn this later in the book that Porthos is working with the apothecary and has some kind of secret plan going on with them. We learn this in a chapter about Rosetta and a conversation she's having with Porthos. And I think that he does have everyone's best interests in mind to an extent, but he also has his own motives. And she's very doubtful of the apothecary and what their goals are. And she doesn't trust the apothecary. But like Carl, he's like, no, you just have to trust me. You have to trust my intuition and believe in me. And ultimately, Rosetta does believe in him and trust him. And I think that we see that a lot with Carl as well, that they're like, no, this is freaking crazy. Like, this is unhinged, but we trust you. Editor's note here, the chapter that we're referencing is titled Rosetta and This Inevitable Ruin. It's between chapter 68 and chapter 69.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the 10th floor that Porthos had just exited. And I'm going to read a quote here. So the 10th had been a nightmare, a world where every physical, non natural object had sapience. Some could speak, all were psychotic. A world where if one object consumed another, it grew in power. By the end, there had been behemoths roaming the barren floor, all searching for one last morsel, all wanting to get bigger. So, assuming that this is kind of like Cuba, where you're just dealing with like the real world, it's just a dungeon version, there are so many objects to interact with.
Yeah.
And if they're all psychotic, that is going to be super stressful and a lot to deal with.
Right. Like, you're just like, I need to open this door. And you go to grab the doorknob and it's like, hey, buddy, get your hands off me. I'll bite your arm off. And then the door is also screaming at you and trying to do stuff. And like everywhere you go, everything except for the rocks and the trees and the grass and the ground has its own agenda and is psychotic. Like, I can't even fathom what that would do to you.
No,
Like,
I mean, it sounds like a sensory nightmare, and that is the biggest understatement on the planet.
yeah, and I mean, aside from the stressful exit from the floor and not knowing what happened to his friend, like, I don't know if any of the other floors that we've seen in the series with Carl and Donut and everyone was as terrible as this one sounds.
No, this sounds like the worst possible scenario to me.
Yeah, like, it's really hard to think about how unnerving that would be, and, like, so even if you're looting this stuff, you're still looting, like, sapient psychotic items. Is everything that the mobs drop also sapient and psychotic? Like, that just sounds terrible.
Well, and I wonder, so in the Cuba level, they did have the announcement that it's going to be in the next chapter that anything that you took from the 8th floor that was a object from before collapse would be deleted from your inventory. So I would think that it would be a same scenario if you did make it onto the 11th floor.
Possibly. Very possible, but
Maybe you just had psychotic scissors to throw at people.
it's in the scissors as they scream through the air. I could almost see
I'll cut you.
I could almost see it like how the sluglos are. They just come out of nowhere and they're like, "Yeah, bitch, take that right in the kisser."
Which I don't know when we're gonna talk about this, so let's talk about it now. One of the things that I think is really cool that I think a lot of people don't pick up on is you know what the Sluggalos are supposed to be based on, right?
Yeah, they're supposed to be based on the Juggalos.
Yes, but because the meeting of the Juggalos is in Detroit, that's why the Sluggalos all really like Amani and are super nice to her all the time.
Right,
And they're like, "Hey, you're 313," which is like their area code.
right.
That gets asked about a lot online.
Yep, yep. I did forget that the gathering happens in Detroit. Um, if you don't know anything about Juggalos or the gathering of the Juggalos, you should look it up. It is unhinged. All right, we get into his lawyer offering him his final deal, which is as a game guide. And in this, Porthos is wondering, what he doesn't even know what the next floor is going to be, but he learns that if you get a description of the next floor, that it usually adds some time to whatever deal you take, a season, couple seasons, which in the scope of 100 seasons doesn't seem that bad. But I do think this is just interesting that they're adding this in here because this chapter not only is giving us a lot of insight into who Porthos is and what his motivations are, but also is giving us some context for how deals work and what that process looks like that we're going to see at the end of book 7 when Carl gets his deal. The choice that Porthos ends up taking is as a game guide for 100 seasons, which is significantly longer than any other deal he's given. But why does he take this deal?
I mean, I think being a game guide does have some benefits in that it gives you a long time to kind of understand how the universe works, what's going on outside the dungeon, if, what we see from Mordecai is any indication, although he might be more plugged in than most, it gives you a lot of time to acclimate and build community and
Hmm.
figure out what you're going to do afterwards. I do think it's really interesting that Odette got out so much earlier than Chaco and Mordecai, and, like, obviously, that's because she took a deal earlier and she was from an earlier season, but it's kind of interesting that they still know that, like, she's out there, she's super successful, and, they still have this complicated history with her, and they still kind of have ways of interacting and, like, poking at each other and, like, attacking each other even though Mordecai's still in the dungeon.
Right, and they get the newsletters that talk about things happening in the dungeon and outside the dungeon. So there is a lot of value in being a game guide, and for Porthos, I think his real motivation here was his drive to give back, to do more, and to help future generations of crawlers. So he does that in the dungeon, he does that through the cookbook, and then he continues doing that after he leaves the dungeon.
Yeah, but I think it is smarter because, like, if you're an NPC who's just, like, guarding a castle, like, you don't know anything, and, like, I don't
No,
think you're interacting with anyone, like, I don't think you have any chance to, like, build that network or, like, build that base of information.
no, I mean, that sounds incredibly boring compared to being a game guide. Like, being a game guide seems kind of fun, honestly. I mean, I think in most cases, with what we see with Mordecai, like, they kind of have this expectation that they're going to be helping you out for the first couple floors. And then after that, they're done for the season. But you know what happens with Mordecai? They get the child actor perk or class that Donut takes where he follows them forever. And he's pretty pissed off about that at first. So Porthos knew immediately that when he left the dungeon, he had plans to take down the crawl. And he starts the Open Intellect Pacifist Network.
Well, and I think that's interesting because I think Carl views that he has to be in the dungeon and has to be actively fighting to be making an impact or to be changing things. And I don't think that point of view changes too much throughout this book, but it'll be interesting to see if it does later on.
Quite probably. One of the last things that we wanted to talk about is his lawyer gives him the option to take a couple of pre-collapse items and some small trinkets from his inventory. No weapons or anything like that. Bree, what was the note you made about this?
That basically, they act like this is the most magnanimous thing that they've ever done, and they're like, "Oh, well, it's a goodwill gesture from us. We want you to have these things because we know it's important." And it's like, "Okay, that's what you guys are doing because you're so nice." Not
So
like,
benevolent.
yeah, you can have, like, I don't know, your favorite hat from the crawl, which would be very important to Donut. I cannot imagine her leaving without her tiara.
What I found interesting with this, though, is this gives you the context of why and how Mordecai has his mother's ashes and has a picture of his brother. And so while this is kind of like a, oh, we're so nice, look at how amazing we're being to you and letting you have these things. For Mordecai, that is extremely important, him being able to have his mother's ashes with him. And also, we see it with some crawlers, but we don't really see it that much of like sentimental items that crawlers bring into the dungeon with them. I think the most prominent example that we see of this in the series is actually the ring that Quan CH brings into the dungeon with him. And when Carl kills him in the Eye of the Bedlam Bride, he asks Carl to give it back to him, and the ring reads on the inside for Daddy. And despite Quan being such a terrible person in the dungeon, you know, he says, my daughter would be ashamed of what I'd become. And it's pretty gut wrenching despite him kind of deserving what happened.
So, when I did my first read through of the book, I was so excited by this chapter. I was so excited that there was going to be multiple points of view going forward. I was extremely excited that it gave the recap at the end that was like, this is what his level was when he finished, and this is where he is now because I could tell from this chapter that they were going to have other chapters from other former crawlers, and I viewed that as a game changer, and I was so excited about it.
Yeah, getting to have chapters from other crawlers outside of just their excerpts from the cookbook is extremely valuable and insightful that we see going out throughout this inevitable ruin. And at the end of this chapter, it also tells you that he is missing and wanted by Syndicate Security, which is a little bit of a teaser for what's to come, because even at this point in the books, we still know next to nothing about Porthus or what the Open Intellect Pacifist Network is really doing.
Definitely, but I was just so excited when I read this chapter because I knew that book 7 was going to be different than the other books, and I really liked the direction it was going in.
Absolutely. Inevitable Ruin does not disappoint. We get some amazing chapters from the viewpoint of previous cookbook authors like Voltaire and Milk throughout. We look forward to having you join us for next week's episode where we find out what's been happening around Earth, how to make shark sushi, and learn the structure of faction wars. Absolutely. Absolutely. Inevitable Ruin does not disappoint at all. We get some amazing chapters from the viewpoint of previous cookbook authors like Voltaire and Milk throughout the book. With that, we look forward to having you join us for next week's episode where we find out what's been happening around Earth, how to make shark sushi, and learn the structure of faction wars. New achievement. You've listened to another episode of The Apocalypse Will Be Podcasted. We release new episodes every Sunday. Visit us on our website to find all our podcast platforms, rss.com/podcasts/The Apocalypse Will Be Podcasted, or follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, the iHeartRadio app, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on Facebook at The Apocalypse Will Be Podcasted and on Instagram at Apocalypse Will Be Podcasted. Now, get out there and like, comment, and subscribe.